this year has been absolutely unlike any that we've known, hasn't it? Especially, I think, for us who live in a society that is relatively free compared to many others on the planet. Because what we've seen, of course, this year is that freedom which we take for granted so much was suddenly curtailed back in March, overnight, pretty much. Our movements all of a sudden were restricted. The rules that we've had to live by about what we can do and what we can't do anymore, they've been changing constantly. There's been uncertainty, and there still is, isn't there? Even today, we sit here wondering when on earth all this will end, and whether we're just about to go back into another great big swathe of what's been happening earlier in the year. All our plans for every one of us, I suspect, have been turned on their heads. But maybe more significantly, brothers and sisters, when it comes to our service to God, things have changed as well. You know, if meeting together for worship and fellowship has been a core part of your life and mine, if that's maybe the time when you feel closest to God, well, all of that was torn away in a moment, wasn't it? And actually, any kind of return to normality, to the way things were, seems to be less likely as the weeks go by. Even for meetings who are beginning to get going again, it's not the same, is it? There isn't the same closeness and fellowship, perhaps, that we've enjoyed in the past. And who knows, we're going in and out of lockdown. Where we'll be next, we might wonder. So how do we cope in times like these? Times when the most common activities that express our faith are not possible to carry on in the way that we have done in the past. I think we see before us a situation that has the potential to sap our faith, to chip away bit by bit at the resolve that we have to keep our service and our worship for God at the very centre of our lives, because so much has changed. Well, of course, scripturally, brothers and sisters, we're not alone, are we, in facing this sort of challenge, where daily life and the routine we have of worship and service to God is suddenly upended. You know, you only have to think back to the first century Jewish believers in the early chapters of Acts and what they faced during the persecution by Saul of Tarsus. You know, what a difference that made to them. Or think of all Christians later in the first century when the Romans began their persecution under Nero. What a difference that made. Or think back to the time we've been reading of in Jeremiah, the exiles in Babylon who for 70 years could not worship their God in the way that they wanted. Not 7 months, but 70 years, where the psalmist said, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" That was real upheaval for them, wasn't it? And then this afternoon, what we're going to think about is the experiences of David, because those are worth us considering as well when we think of the challenge of having everything that you know turned on its head. Because, of course, in David's life, you've got 2 periods like that, haven't you, that are recorded for us in Scripture. 2 periods where David found himself separated from family for much of the time, separated from his home, separated from the center of worship for God in the land of Israel, separated from every element of his religious life that he'd maybe known and treasured. And David went through those periods without any kind of certainty as to when that would end, when things would get back to normal. Now, of course, what we've got in the scriptures is 2 narrative records of those periods in 1 Samuel and in 2 Samuel, giving us the facts of what went on in those periods. But more importantly, and perhaps more for our benefit, brothers and sisters, we have the Psalms that David wrote during those times. And what that does for us, of course, is it tells us how David felt. It tells us how David presented the challenges he faced to God and how he dealt with those problems mentally. And that, for me, really is where the exhortation can be found for you and me today, when we bring together the Samuel record of what was going on and the Psalms record of how David felt and thought about those matters. So in this first study, we're going to have a look at this first period, the one that we read about in 1 Samuel, when David, as a young man, went from the position of being armor bearer to Saul, a captain of the army, a member of the royal household, son-in-law to the king, to suddenly find himself on the run as an outlaw. The very man who'd put him in that position now seeking his life. And there are a number of psalms that cover those events. And this is where we find out whether the technology really works. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. Philip and Hilary, can you give me the thumbs up again if you can see that? That's wonderful. You're the people I can see on my screen, just in case you're wondering why I keep picking on you. But there you go. Those are a run of the Psalms, which pick up that period of David as a young man on the run from Saul. How do I know those are the Psalms from that period? Well, the giveaway for most of those, thankfully, is in the title of the Psalm, like the one that we've just read just now, Psalm 57. And in other Psalms where it doesn't tell us quite so obviously, some of the content of the Psalm maybe gives that away instead. We're not going to look in detail at all of those Psalms, but what I would recommend, brothers and sisters, is you keep one finger around Psalm 57 to 63 and keep another finger in Psalm 142, 143, because those are the ones that I'm going to pick up some content from in this study. What are we going to learn then from David and his experiences when we start looking at these Psalms from this time in his life as an outlaw? Well, what we do find is there are a number of common themes that keep coming out. And the first theme, which isn't really a surprise to come out from these Psalms, is this: that David never gives up on prayer. Even when life is difficult for him, even when he finds himself very far away from the fellowship and the worship which he's enjoyed up till this point in his life, if anything, his prayers to God actually become more urgent. And we know that, of course, because the Psalms themselves are prayers, aren't they? If you look at the beginning of Psalm 57, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I make my refuge until these calamities have passed by. I will cry out to God most high." And look at Psalm 63. He says, "O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water." Or Psalm 142, "I cry out to the Lord with my voice to the Lord I make my supplication." And 143, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In your faithfulness answer me, and in your righteousness." So there they are. All of these Psalms from that period, there are prayers from David to God. And it's very clear then that David never lets up. And there then set before you and me straight away is the choice that you and I have, brothers and sisters, whenever we face challenges in life, however great or small they are. On the one hand, we can give up prayer, can't we? We may stop praying to God because we feel that prayer has become ineffective in some way. I mean, after all, if our prayer to God was effective, why are we still in this situation? Why have we not been dug out of the problem that we're in? That's a very natural response, isn't it, to a challenge and to prayer that appears to go unanswered. Or the alternative for us is that we pray more. That what we do day by day is that we lay those issues that we have before God, even if there doesn't seem to be a solution, even if it appears for the moment that there is no answer forthcoming from God. Because, of course, that's what David does in these Psalms, brothers and sisters. Is David in a hole, literally, and yet he never gives up on his prayer. And in a way, that's the second theme that comes out when we read these Psalms, because it's very clear to us that there were periods in this time, in these years when David was on the run from Saul, when there was no visible solution. David could not in any way see a way out of his situation. And what we see in the Psalms then is that David felt at times overwhelmed by that situation. And David doesn't hide his feelings from God. He doesn't try to internalize it and not talk about it. David talks about it with the highest authority, with God himself. Just, if you're still in Psalm 57, just come down to verse 6, where he says, talking of Saul and his other enemies, they've prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have dug a pit for me. This constant setting of traps by Saul was wearing David down. It bowed his soul down because his life was constantly in danger. You know, brothers and sisters, we have to appreciate, don't we, when we read of what David was going through, that this wasn't some kind of game of hide and seek that he was playing with Saul. You know, there was no fun in this. This was a life and death situation, and neither was David through these years living some kind of Old Testament version of Robin Hood and his merry men. If we want to know what it was like for David and how he felt, we only need to read these words in the Psalms. Just go back to verse 4 in Psalm 57, where David says, "My soul is among lions. I lie among the sons of men who are set on fire, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword." That's David's assessment of those men who were with him at that time. Lions, people set on fire, sharp teeth, and a sharp tongue. And we can understand actually why David felt that way about those men who had joined. And remember what we're actually told about that group of men here in 1 Samuel 22. You can see on screen, David departed from there. That was from being with Samuel, and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. 400 men, every one of them unhappy with life. Men who'd fallen out of favour with King Saul, men who had an axe to grind and were not slow to come forward to try and grind that axe when the opportunity arose. Those were the people that David was surrounded with all day. And we can see the impact of that, can't we? A couple of chapters on in 1 Samuel 24. This is here we are, David in the cave. Maybe this is when Psalm 57 was written. It says there, he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. And then we read that David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. The men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." That was the attitude of those men, wasn't it? They were very willing and able to encourage David there to commit regicide, to kill his king, the Lord's anointed. And that was the attitude that David was living there with every day in such desperate circumstances. Just keep your finger in Psalm 57 and come over to Psalm 142 and see how desperate these circumstances were that David talks about here. how overwhelmed he was. He says in verse 3 of Psalm 142, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path. In the way in which I walk, they have secretly set a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. And so even though David was there amongst 400 unhappy men, yet he felt complete isolation. There were times when David felt that no one cared about him. That there were many around him who all the time were working to set a trap for him. Imagine how overwhelmed you would feel with that situation, brothers and sisters, where you couldn't take comfort from those around, and further away were all these people who were only looking at you for their own gain, to see how they could bring you down. And when we go back to the narrative in Samuel, we see that, don't we? We can see the sort of situation that would bring David to feel in that way. It's there again in 1 Samuel 23, when David has gone to Keilah and he saved the people of Keilah, and there he is in that town. He hears that Saul is coming, and he prays to God and says, will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. And David said, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver you. The people you've saved from the Philistines will betray you to Saul. How would you feel about that, brothers and sisters? And in the very same chapter, a few verses later on, the Ziphites come to Saul at Gibeah saying, is David not hiding with us in strongholds in the woods, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. His own countrymen were willing and wanting to deliver up David into the hands of Saul. It's no wonder, is it, that for that period in his life, David and his men ended up living in the caves, as we read there in Samuel. And in actual fact, if you're over in the 140s, look at Psalm 143 again and just pick it up at verse 3 of this period. David says, for the enemy has persecuted my soul. He's crushed my life to the ground. He has made me to dwell in darkness like those who've been long dead. Therefore my spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is distressed. So there he was, forced to live in the darkness, surrounded by angry men, isolated eventually even from his own family, because he had to take them across to Moab for their own safety. And these psalms that David wrote then bring out to us, don't they, the crushing effect that had on David's spirit. You see how many times he says how overwhelmed he is. This is a man suffering the sensation of depression, isn't it, where he is overwhelmed. And alongside all of that, brothers and sisters, alongside that crushing feeling, we have another theme that comes out in these psalms, and it's this. It's the desire that David has to be in God's presence, because that's where David really wants to be. He doesn't want to be in a cave at all. Or at that time, he doesn't want to be with many of those unhappy men. Look at, if you're still in Psalm 143, he says to God, I spread out my hands to you. My soul longs for you like a thirsty land. It's in God's presence that David wants to be. He wants to be back there at the tabernacle with people like Samuel, able to worship God there. Or come back, if you will, to Psalm 63, where he expands on the same thought. I hope you kept your fingers in these psalms. I did say we to and fro a bit. Psalm 63 and verse 1. O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. It's interesting, isn't it, brothers and sisters, that that's the thing that David misses most. That's the desire which he talks about when he's on the run. It's not the home comforts. He doesn't talk about missing his couch. He doesn't talk about missing his family even. Doesn't mention his wife while he's away from Michael, who he's been separated from. What he misses is his opportunity to visit the sanctuary and to worship his God. And there's another exhortation just sitting there in David's words, isn't there, brothers and sisters? You know, when we find ourselves faced with challenges in life, is the meeting, is our shared worship with brothers and sisters in Christ, is that the place of spiritual refuge that you and I long for? Is it something that we miss as much as we would miss a glass of water? Or is our shared worship, is our fellowship with other believers something that actually we could just, take or leave and it doesn't really bother us? Have we missed being together with our brothers and sisters during this COVID era or not? How much is our desire to be back together in person rather than just like we are today on screen? To get an idea actually as to how David felt about this, just look at this other psalm that David wrote that's picked up in the Songs of Degrees. Psalm 122, there on the screen. David says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built as a city that's compact together, where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to the testimony of Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. When you read those words, you can sense, can't you, the joyous anticipation of being with his brothers and sisters of the people of Israel. That's what David felt about being together in Jerusalem to praise and to worship God, not on his own, but together with others, where they were able to encourage each other in their faith. And I wonder, brothers and sisters, do we have that same anticipation to have our physical fellowship restored back to us? Or are we really comfortable now with armchair worship? Are we quite happy just sitting on our sofas and leaving it at that? How much do we want to be together with others in whatever we consider to be our sanctuary? Well, there's something to think about. But let's go on and consider this. How did David then cope with his situation, with that loss of all the comfort he'd ever enjoyed in life, the loss of fellowship with other Israelites who wanted to be there worshipping God with him, the loss of his family being around him? What is it that these Psalms teach us about how he dealt with that? Well, I think the first thing we see in these Psalms is that David appreciates that for all he has lost the ability to be there at the physical centre of Israel's worship, nevertheless, David hasn't lost the presence of God himself. Because David knows, doesn't he, that God's not constrained by location. That the God that David worshipped isn't a God who's only in the sanctuary, and if David's not in the sanctuary, then he's not near God anymore. In fact, David acknowledges, doesn't he, in these Psalms, that those very wings of the cherubim which overshadowed the ark, the wings of the cherubim which encircle the throne of God, were also encircling him at this time. He says that, doesn't he, back in Psalm 57 in verse 1. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge. In the shadow of your wings. And he says the same again, actually, a couple of pages later in Psalm 63, in verse 7. He says to God, because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. Even though David is now in a cave or stuck out in the desert in fear of his life, he knows that actually God is close enough to him for him to be able to take refuge in the shadow of God's wings. It's a reference back, of course, isn't it, to one of his own ancestors, because that's the words that Boaz uses to Ruth, isn't it? The Lord repay your work, he says, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. And there's a lovely exhortation for us. You know, this reference to being under the shadow of God's wings. It reminds us of the presence of God being near us, and the wings of the cherubim overshadowing us, just as they overshadowed the ark. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's an acknowledgement as well. That refuge is there because God is able to provide it for us. In fact, only God can provide us with the refuge of his wings, wherever we are. I think it's quite interesting that actually when you get to the end of David's reign, you have people at the end of his reign like Joab and Adonijah who actually go off running to the tabernacle and grab a hold on the horns of the altar, don't they? Because they feel that sort of physical closeness to the ark and the physical presence of God, that somehow that's going to give them a refuge and a place of safety, which of course for both of those men didn't prove to be the case at all. But here, for David, the young man, who's miles away from the tabernacle, is nowhere near the overshadowing wings of the cherubim on the ark there. Nevertheless, he didn't need to be there, did he? Because he was able, wherever he was, to find refuge and to know that his God was close to him. He says it in Psalm 59, and it's a repeated theme in these Psalms. Psalm 59, verse 16. He says, I'll sing of your power. Yes, I'll sing aloud of your mercy in the morning, for you have been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble. My defense and refuge. And come over, if you will, to Psalm 142 again, where he says in verse 5, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. And again in Psalm 143 and verse 9, deliver me, O Lord, from my enemies. In you I take shelter. And here then is one of our coping mechanisms, brothers and sisters, just as it was a coping mechanism for David. You know, that whilst you and I undoubtedly, I'm sure, miss all our meetings, miss the fellowship and the physical presence of our brothers and sisters that we have in the places where we've been worshipping maybe for decades, it doesn't mean, does it, that somehow we are further away from God. You know, if David could feel that even in a cave in the desert, he was under the shadow of God's wings and God was that near to him, then God is just as near to you and me as we sit in our homes week by week today. There's another coping mechanism as well that comes out in these Psalms, brothers and sisters, and it's this, that David, with all those hours which he had to spend cooped up in a cave or stuck looking at the horizon in the desert, didn't spend his time bemoaning his situation and just complaining to his fellow Israelites there about it. What David spent his time doing, it seems, is meditating. And we see that back in Psalm 63. Let's pick up a verse there. Psalm 63 and verse 6. He says, when I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. And again, come over to Psalm 143 and verse 5 this time. Psalm 143, verse 5. In the same vein, he says, I remember the days of old. I meditate on all your works. I muse on the works of your hands. Now, I guess meditation in that way can go either of two ways, really, can't it, brothers and sisters? Sitting there thinking for long periods of time can turn us very much inwards. It can make us think of nothing but ourselves, our own situation, how hard it is for us. We can end up being very self-pitying, can't we, brothers and sisters, if we sit just thinking all day long. Or it can help us to get a much greater perspective on our lives, because what we do is not look inwardly, but rather turn outwardly and look at things around us, what's going on with others and what God is doing. And that, of course, is what David does, isn't it? He says, what was he said there in Psalm 143? I meditate on all your works. I muse on the works of your hands. That's what David is doing. And his meditation then leads him to have a much more positive frame of mind, because what David is doing is focusing through his meditation on God rather than himself. Now, I have to say, brothers and sisters, that does not mean for 1 minute that just sitting thinking and trying to think about God and what God is doing will instantly change our feelings. And when we read these Psalms of David, I think it's very clear as we read through them that David had to work really hard on thinking about the right things and trying to pull his thoughts away from how overwhelming his situation seemed to be to consider the goodness of God instead. And I don't think that came easy for David, just as it doesn't come easy for us. Just if you will, look at Psalm 57 and notice what I'm going to call the yo-yo that David goes through here as he contemplates his own situation, and then he thinks about God. Look at verse 4 of Psalm 57. He says, my soul is among lions. I lie among the sons of men who are set on fire, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword. And you can see David there, can't you? Struggling with how bad his situation is. And yet verse 5, up he comes. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth. And then verse 6 again, they have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They've dug a pit before me. Into the midst of it, they themselves have fallen. Down he goes again, but he comes back up. Verse 7, my heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise. And David now manages to carry on pulling upwards as he comes to the end of the psalm. He says in verse 8, awake, my glory, awake. Lute and harp, I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing to you among the nations. For your mercy reaches unto the heavens, and your truth unto the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth. It's interesting to watch that, isn't it, brothers and sisters? The downs and the ups, even in the space of the psalm, as David tries to meditate away from his own situation and towards thinking about God instead. Just notice there's some ideas that come out here. Actually, at the end of verse 3, David says, God shall send forth his mercy and his truth. And he picks that up again at the end of this section in verse 10. He says, for your mercy reaches unto the heavens and your truth unto the clouds. So there's that repeated idea of God's mercy and truth, which David latches onto. What David's doing there, brothers and sisters, is he's reminding himself of two characteristics of God. On the one hand, there is God's truth, and truth there, the word means God's faithfulness. In other words, if God has said that he will do something, he will absolutely bring it about. You think of David contemplating that. God does what he says he'll do. And on the other hand, there's this characteristic as well of God's mercy, that even when David falters, he can have the reassurance that he worships a God who's willing to forgive. And those are the things that David brings to mind in these dire situations that he faces. And it's that contemplation that helps David to get himself back to a positive mindset again, despite his circumstances. In fact, actually, we can see in these Psalms just how far David is able to bring himself beyond his current situation to see a much brighter future before him, because of the faithfulness of God, because of God's truth, that God will do what he said he'll do. Look at Psalm 63 and just a verse there, the very last verse actually, verse 11. He says there, "The king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory, but the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped." You notice that? But the king shall rejoice in God. Who's the king he's speaking about? It's himself. David is the king because God had anointed him back there in Bethlehem. And even though, as David is now an outlaw from Saul, that might have seemed like a very hollow hope indeed. Nevertheless, it's what David believed. And he trusted that one day God would be able to deliver that. So there we go. David was through his meditation able to focus on God rather than himself, to bring about a more positive frame of mind. And what he really thought about was God's mercy and God's truth, the forgiveness that God offered him and God's faithfulness. So that David could, even with confidence still, look forward from his cave to one day sitting on the throne of Israel. Here was a God who would assuredly deliver what he'd promised, to put his king on his throne in Zion. And that's the same God, brothers and sisters, that you and I serve today, isn't it? The same God who was able to put his king on the throne in Israel back then is the same God who's promised to do that for us today. And it might be difficult for you and me to see sometimes how God will ever manage that. How will God bring about this change from the chaos of the world that we know today to a world that is full of his glory? It might make it difficult at times for you and I to be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, brothers and sisters. But the light's there, isn't it? We only need to look back at the works of God to know that God will deliver what he has promised in the future. As David says, "I remember the days of old. I meditate on all your works. I muse on the works of your hands." And that should be our individual commitment, brothers and sisters. If it's not something that we do already, to think about what God has done, to meditate ourselves on the works of his hands. Let's finish then with some words from Psalm 63, where David talks again about what he's thought about and how it's changed his perspective. He said in verse 6, "When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. Because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. My soul follows close behind you. Your right hand upholds me." Lovely words, those, brothers and sisters, because what they tell us is that David's meditation on his God was able to turn a dark corner of a cave into the shadow of God's wings. It was able to turn the hard stone that he was lying on into the right hand of the Almighty, holding him up. And I guess the question for you and me is, well, can today's pandemic bring you and me closer to God in the same way? Thank you.